Boys and girls of every age, wouldn't you like to see something strange? The radio blasted that tune so loudly the neighborhood's windows were shaking. It was early 2010, and when Halloween came around, all teenagers in town turned into some candy-gobbling, horror-loving freaks. I was obviously one of them too. And so when Simon announced he was going to make the biggest, loudest, freakiest Halloween party in the woods behind his house, we were all spooked and thrilled. What I forgot to mention is that Simon was a wealthy kid. You all know the one. Always wear the most expensive hoodies, the trendiest shoes, and he always was the first one in town to get the latest piece of technology. So, we were all pretty excited about his party announcement. He held a few parties before, and everyone who didn't get a chance to be invited or couldn't make it were pretty much pariah by now. Simon's parties were the place to be when you were a 16-year-old growing up in Dry Ridge, Kentucky. Everyone in high school knew about Simon, and everyone wanted in on the party business, me included. The last party I'd gone to was when his parents went to Monaco for a couple of weeks, and I remember us doing the biggest hot box in the indoor garden area of his home. I live about 3 streets down from him, and it took me all of 2 hours to get home at the end of that night. Fortunately for me, my parents are pretty cool. I can go out whenever I want, come back as late as I want. It's probably due to the fact that our criminal rate here is really low. We had a few home invasions, and the local grocery store got their fair share of holdups. But outside of that, it was pretty calm. Kids are not exactly in danger here. So when I hit 15, I pretty much was given consent to do whatever the heck I wanted to, as long as it didn't impact my grades. And of course, I was born a genius, so my grades weren't going to be affected no matter what. Well, alright, maybe not a genius, I was just good in school, I guess. Anyway, here I was, walking down the neighborhood with approximately, 12 or 13 other kids, blasting the Nightmare Before Christmas soundtrack and some Marilyn Manson. We were all disguised, obviously, it was Halloween. Some costumes were pretty fucking rad if you asked me. Mine was just a simple Halloween mask with ketchup stains, a black t-shirt that said Nightmare on Elm Street, and a pair of black jeans. I was Freyson, if somebody asked, or Jetty. Thankfully, nobody asked. But let's not forget about my favorite part of Halloween. The girls, obviously. When you're 16 years old and you've got something to flaunt, you flaunt it on Halloween because come Sunday, you're the lovely neighborhood church girl. Now, I'd never seen a slutty demon nurse Joy before Halloween, but Sasha really pulled the look off with that cute pastel dress, blood-soaked knee-high socks, 3 tons of mascara and bloody tears streaking down her face. She was the perfect mix of absolutely creepy, sexy, and lovely. But never mind her. There was also a sexy cat, sexy construction worker, and a sexy librarian. Well, I think that's what she was, at least. The less cute ones opted for witches and vampire costumes, but all in all, everyone seemed to be having fun. Girls always went the extra mile on Halloween, but most guys' costumes were pretty ordinary. I wasn't the worst one of the lot, I assure you. Some guy came in wearing a shirt that said, werewolf with the check mark next to it. And that was his costume. There was one guy that went over the top, though. Creepy leather face mask, with a Hannibal Lecter contraption encasing the lower half of his face. You could see the bolts and the rust that was eating through it. The way the mask was made also seemed to make believe his whole jaw had been replaced with rusted metal. His lips were all but torn and gone, revealing rusted nails and screws in lieu of his teeth. The mask went all the way around his head, and only a few scarce holes on the surface let a few wild brown strands of hair out of it. His clothes looked like they'd been dragged through the mud, sweat and piss before drying. And when he moved, there was a scratchy noise coming from his pants, like sandpaper rubbing against sandpaper. I was sure that if I touched his rags, I would probably get a nasty infection. The guy reeked and looked of infection. He would have won the creepiest costume award in an instant, had there been a contest. Even the girls were giving him shifty eyes and stayed away from him. Also, considering the thickness and the rigidity of his clothes, it was hard to say who it was. We all assumed it was Jay, mostly because he's the one who hadn't joined us yet. And when praised about his costume, he didn't deny or admit to the identity we gave him. We were a little spooked, but we supposed it was Halloween, and Jay was doing the whole serial killer vibe in good fun. I eventually stopped looking at him because Nurse Joy was stealing my attention. Didn't even notice he was gone until later. We finally reached Simon's house and followed the trail that went to the spot in the woods. There were a lot of fake spider webs and huge dollar store decorations, but it definitely set the mood to party wild. Even the guy holding the radio was screaming over his loud Slipknot tune. Simon was waiting for us at the end of the trail, which was frankly longer than I expected. It was about 15 minutes deep into the woods behind his backyard. Once we arrived, we saw Simon standing in front of a couple of picnic tables. One was filled with bagged snacks such as chips and Cheetos, pretzels and the like, and the other table had little cans of cocoa and Sprite. And there was a cooler full of fruity beers, juice, vodka, and rum. We also had these little plastic cups too. It was actually pretty neat. The radio was settled on the snack table, and the music kept playing for a while. I looked around and talked with a few people, but realized quickly that Nurse Joy was gone. I didn't even think about Creepy Jay either, but I felt like our little group was just a little smaller than what it was when we walked down the trail. I mean, had people turned and left already? Before I could investigate around me for Nurse Joy, I was offered a joint, and who was I to deny? I took a deep drag and laughed with my friends, forgetting momentarily about those who might have left the party early. But then, Jay came back. Now, well, nobody really noticed that first, but he was just standing there. He was a bit taller than most of us, but he was just there, leaning on a tree and staring at the party. I caught a glimpse of something shiny in his left hand and my eyes wandered down a little. He was holding a machete, and while it looked really cool with his costume, I instantly fell ill. My stomach churned and my anxiety level spiked at the sight of what definitely didn't look like ketchup coating it. Now I know some people who are pretty good at making fake blood out of cornstarch and corn syrup and red food coloring, but this didn't look like it. Even in the dark, the consistency of the coating on his machete blade made me feel deeply unsettled. I poked my nearest friend and pointed in the guy's direction. Unfortunately, said friend wasn't as observant, and he just said cool costume before resuming his drag on the spliff. I shook him again and pointed at the machete, as subtly as I could, because I didn't want to cause panic or raise suspicions. But maybe I was just getting high. Maybe it really was fake blood. Now I swear, I stopped looking at him for a fraction of a second. And he was there. And then now he wasn't. I felt the hair on my nape stand up on end, and suddenly, I didn't feel like staying at the party. I felt something cold in the back of my throat, and a feeling of impending doom grew in my guts. I had to leave. But those leave early are bound to be mocked. I mean, maybe I could just go tell Simon that I didn't feel right then and leave. But I couldn't find Simon. We were about 12 to 15 people when the party started, and now we were 10. 5 people were gone, including Jay, Simon, and Nurse Joy. A group of 3 girls dancing blew me off, and the others were too busy making their drinks and smoking to care about a few people who had gone missing. For all I knew, they were fucking in the woods or something. Now I really wanted my instincts to be wrong. I really wanted to go back to the party and enjoy myself, but, well, something just didn't add up. And it was all confirmed when a long, heart-wrenching scream tore through the woods. I felt my entire body stiffen as that scream ended in a loud, disgusting gargling noise followed by a heavy thumping. The music might not have stopped, but everyone was fully alert now that something was happening. Except for a few idiots who said it was just for ambiance and that Simon was just going the extra mile. Proof is that he wasn't even there, right? But then I asked about Sasha and Jay. They weren't particularly tight-knit with Simon, and probably wouldn't be on some ambiance business. But nobody could answer me. When I said we needed to leave, I was laughed and called a pussy. But it didn't matter anymore. I turned my back on the party and started walking back toward the trail. But I stopped dead in my tracks. At the entrance of the trail, Jay, who was definitely not Jay, was holding a disembodied head in the air. I didn't need light to recognize the pink hair, the bloody trail of tears, and 3 pounds of mascara on Sasha's devilish Nurse Joy costume. I started screaming. At least I think so. That was until I felt something hit me in my stomach. Hard. I caught it on reflex and screamed even louder as I realized it was the still warm head of Sasha that had been thrown at me. I threw the head and threw up instantly, and before I knew it, my legs had started moving on their own. Not toward the trail, not towards the music, not toward the scream, but towards the woods at such a speed that I didn't even know I could. I heard screaming behind me as well as the sound of splashing, of guts spilling. I didn't look back, but I heard steps behind me. Whether they were steps fleeing from the scene or rushing after me didn't matter. I needed out of this nightmare. And as I kept running, I tripped and fell on my face. But when I tried to stand up quickly, my hand buried in something cold, wet and spongy. I turned my head only to face Jay's eviscerated corpse. It looked like he had been there for a while, because his body had grown cold. I felt my heart rise in my throat again as I stood up, and I'm pretty sure a mix of sweat and tears was rushing down my face as I kept running into the woods. The screams were growing distant, but not enough to my taste, and I could still hear steps from behind me. I was praying to all the gods up there and demons down there to not let my ass be slashed by some crazy Halloween psycho killer. But I was getting deeper into the woods, and honestly, I should have been worried about that a little more as well. My heart was beating so fast it felt like it was going to explode like 1,000 pieces of shredded muscle. I didn't know how long I've run, but I know that at some point, I heard a truck horn and rushed in the direction. I found myself on a stretch of highway outside of town, and I couldn't hear any steps coming from behind me anymore. But I was covered in blood and grime, sweat and tears, and my Freddy shirt had leaves stuck to it. I took off my hockey mask, which was covered in vomit, and threw it aside. My whole body was shaking and my nerves were making me jumpy. It was late, too, and there weren't many cars in sight at this hour in this small town of Dry Ridge, Kentucky. I spat and spat again to try and get rid of the taste of barf in my mouth, and I crossed the street so I wouldn't be on the same side as the killer. I kept myself low as I walked back into town and to my home. I came home and my parents were awake. I'm sure they were full of questions about where I was and why I came home so late. But when they saw the state I was in, they didn't ask anything. I broke down in tears as they called the police, but it took me a couple of hours to get a coherent sentence out. Not that I needed to. I wasn't the only survivor. They found another kid in the woods at dawn, hiding under a corpse. Another one made it back home but had a huge slash on her back that forced her to stay in the hospital for a few days. Adrenaline was probably the only thing that helped her make it back home. They found about 8 corpses in various states with limbs cut off and gashes that left them no chance of survival unless they had help in the few minutes following the attack. The screams probably also alerted the neighbors, even though we were 15 minutes into the woods. But nobody called. It was Halloween, and kids were bound to do some dumb shit. And who would have thought that a place like Dry Ridge, Kentucky, could be subjected to such violence anyway? It's been over 10 years and I still dream about it every night. I remember the feeling of my hand plunging into that corpse, of the weight of that head in my hands. I remember the smell of blood so strongly that the sight of even a single drop of it makes me sick nowadays. And even though I know the monster is locked up behind bars, I couldn't stay in the town after that. I forced my parents to move to a bigger city where the crime rate was higher. Because in the end, what the fuck does it matter? Small town, big town. There are monsters everywhere. You just have to be unlucky enough to meet one.